The Kitchen Table Note, Chapter 1, The Echo in the Empty House, Ohio 2024. The old farmhouse stood sentinel amidst overgrown fields, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had moved on without it. For decades, it had remained empty, a silent monument to a shattered past. Emily Johnson, now 65, had finally returned. Recently widowed, adrift in her own quiet grief, she felt a profound, almost magnetic pull back to the place of her childhood, the house that held the unspeakable sorrow that had torn her family apart. The tragedy had happened in 1972, a summer day that should have been filled with laughter. Her younger sister Sarah, vibrant and full of life, had died in what was deemed a tragic accident. After that, everything changed. Her mother, Margaret, once a beacon of warmth and creativity, retreated into a shell, eventually leaving the family without a word, disappearing into the vast unknown. Her father, Daniel, a man of stern traditional values, sealed himself off in a fortress of silence, never speaking of Sarah, never speaking of Margaret. Emily, a bewildered teenager, had fled soon after, seeking solace and a new life far from the suffocating silence of that house, never looking back. Until now. The house was cold, dusty, and smelled of neglect. Old furniture, shrouded in white sheets, stood like ghosts in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Emily moved through the familiar rooms, each step an echo of a life long gone. She touched the peeling wallpaper, the faded floral patterns, memories flickering like old film. She walked into the kitchen, the heart of any home, now a cavern of silence. The large, sturdy oak table, where countless meals had been shared, where homework had been done, where laughter and arguments had once filled the air, stood in the center, covered by a thick layer of dust and a faded, floral-patterned tablecloth. It was the same tablecloth, she remembered, her mother had always used. A strange compulsion guided her hand. She slowly, carefully, peeled back the corner of the tablecloth, disturbing decades of settled dust. As the fabric lifted, revealing the dark, polished wood beneath, she saw it. Taped securely to the tabletop, almost camouflaged by the aging wood, was a small, yellowed piece of paper. Her heart leaped, a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was her mother's handwriting, unmistakable. Her fingers trembled as she carefully unpeeled the tape, the paper brittle and fragile. The single note, written in a hurried, almost desperate script, contained only a few words. Emily, this is not what you think. Mom, 1973. Emily gasped, a choked sound, lost in the echoing silence of the kitchen. 1973. That was just 1 year after Sarah's death. 1 year after the tragedy that had, in Emily's mind, directly caused her mother's abandonment. This is not what you think. The words reverberated in her mind, a powerful contradiction to the narrative she had constructed for half a century. A narrative of abandonment, of a mother broken by grief and simply walking away. Her mother hadn't just left. She had left a message, a clue, a profound, cryptic confession from the past. The silence that had defined their family, that had buried the truth of Sarah's death and Margaret's departure, was suddenly shattered by a single, desperate whisper from a woman Emily thought she would never understand. The house, once a tomb of sorrow, had become a puzzle box, and this note was the first terrifying piece, demanding to be solved. And in solving it, Emily knew she might finally uncover the long-buried truth that had fractured her entire life. Chapter 2, The Silent Chasm. The note, fragile and profound, resonated in Emily's hands. Emily, this is not what you think. Mom, 1973. The year was etched into her memory, a stark marker in the timeline of her family's devastation. 1973, a year after Sarah's death, the year her mother vanished, the year her father retreated behind an impenetrable wall of silence. Emily's childhood, before 1972, had been idyllic. Sarah, her younger sister, had been a bright, vivacious child, her laughter like wind chimes in the house. Margaret, their mother, was an artist, a dreamer, filling their home with music, paintings, and whimsical stories. Daniel, their father, a stoic but loving man, provided a steady anchor, his presence a comforting weight. They were, in Emily's memory, a unit, a complete family. Then came that dreadful summer day. Sarah, playing near the old abandoned well on their property, had fallen. It was a tragic, freak accident, or so they had been told. The details were vague, shrouded in the chaos of grief. One moment Sarah was there, a vibrant splash of color in the sunny yard. The next, she was gone, leaving behind an unbearable void. The aftermath was a descent into silence. Margaret, once so vibrant, withered. Her laughter ceased. Her paintings lay unfinished. She moved like a ghost through the house, her eyes haunted. Daniel, usually stern but expressive in his own way, became utterly mute on the subject of Sarah. No one spoke her name. No one acknowledged the gaping hole she left behind. It was as if by not speaking of her, they could somehow erase the pain, or perhaps keep the tragedy at bay. Emily, a bewildered 15-year-old, watched her family disintegrate. She tried to reach out to her mother, but Margaret's gaze was distant, unseeing. She tried to talk to her father, but his face was a mask of unyielding grief and stoicism. The silence was suffocating, a heavy blanket that smothered all attempts at connection, all expressions of sorrow. Then, one rainy Tuesday morning in 1973, Margaret was simply gone. No note, no explanation, just an empty space at the breakfast table, a half-packed suitcase in the hall closet, and the indelible scent of her lavender soap. Emily was told by her father that her mother couldn't cope, that the grief was too much for her. Emily had accepted it, understanding it as a desperate act of a broken woman. But she had also felt a profound sense of abandonment, a deeper layer of loss on top of Sarah's death. Her father, after Margaret's departure, became even more rigid, more distant. He moved them out of the house a few years later, unable to bear the memories, and eventually sold it, never returning. Emily, feeling utterly alone, left for college the moment she turned 18, building a life far away, rarely looking back at the painful past she had left behind in Ohio. The house stood empty, a monument to their fractured family, its secrets locked away behind dusty windows and locked doors. Now that single note, dated 1973, challenged everything she thought she knew. This is not what you think. If Margaret hadn't left because she couldn't cope with Sarah's death, then why? What else could there possibly be? What secret, what truth lay hidden beneath the decades of silence? The house, once a place of unbearable sadness, suddenly felt alive with a new purpose. It wasn't just a collection of painful memories. It was a puzzle, a labyrinth of clues left by her mother, daring her to uncover the truth. Emily felt a strange sense of anticipation, a thrilling fear. She had to find out. She had to understand what her mother had meant, what had truly shattered their family. The note was not just a whisper from the past. It was a desperate plea, a challenge to break the silence, to unearth the long-buried truth, and perhaps, finally, to heal the wounds that had festered for half a century. Chapter 3: The Ghost of Memory. Armed with her mother's enigmatic note. Emily, this is not what you think. Mom, 1973. Emily began a meticulous search of the old house. The air was thick with the dust of decades, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper secrets. She felt like an archaeologist, painstakingly unearthing layers of a forgotten civilization. She started with the kitchen table, running her hands over the smooth wood. Where else might her mother have left a message, a hidden clue? Margaret was an artist, a woman who saw beauty and meaning in unconventional places. Emily knew her mother loved riddles, subtle hints. This wouldn't be a straightforward treasure hunt. She moved through the downstairs rooms, her senses heightened. In the living room, a faint disturbance in the pattern of the old floral wallpaper caught her eye. It was near the fireplace, slightly frayed at the edges. Carefully, she peeled back a small section. Tucked behind it, in a small, damp-stained envelope, was another note, also in Margaret's hand. My dearest girl, look to the light, where shadows dance at noon. M. No date this time, but the familiar script, where shadows dance at noon. Emily looked around the living room. It was morning now, but she imagined the midday sun streaming through the tall windows. Shadows would stretch, shift, and fall across the floor. She waited, patiently. When noon arrived, a shaft of sunlight pierced the dusty room, illuminating a specific spot on the floor near an antique writing desk. A small, dark shadow, cast by a tiny decorative keyhole on the desk side, danced precisely on a loose floorboard. Emily's heart pounded. She knit, her fingers exploring the old wood. With a quiet groan, the floorboard lifted. Beneath it, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, was a small, ornate silver locket. It was tarnished with age, but Emily recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Sarah. A locket she had often worn, containing a tiny, faded picture of Emily and Sarah, laughing, their arms around each other. Emily gasped, tears stinging her eyes. Sarah's locket. Why was it hidden? Why here? Tucked with the locket was another small, folded piece of paper. This one was even more faded, almost illegible. She squinted, deciphering the faint words. The greatest burden is the truth unspoken. Remember the willow. M. The greatest burden is the truth unspoken. Emily's mind reeled. This wasn't just about her mother's departure. This was about a secret, a truth, and it was connected to Sarah. Remember the willow. The old willow tree stood by the creek in the backyard, its branches drooping, almost touching the water. A favorite spot for Sarah, a place where they had spent countless childhood hours. Emily felt a chill, despite the warmth of the sun through the window. These weren't random clues. These were carefully placed breadcrumbs, leading her deeper into a mystery she hadn't known existed. The house, once a repository of her pain, had become a living memory, whispering secrets across decades. She ventured outside, towards the old willow. Its ancient branches swayed gently in the breeze. Emily ran her hands along the rough bark, her mind racing. What could be hidden here? Was it another note? A physical object? Her fingers brushed against a hollow in the tree's gnarled trunk, just above a low-hanging branch. She reached inside, her heart pounding. Her fingers closed around something hard, metallic. She pulled it out. It was a rusted, intricately carved tin box. It was cold to the touch, heavy with the weight of time and secrets. Emily's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves, and faded remnants of a child's ribbon lay a thick, leather-bound diary, her mother's diary, and a stack of letters, yellowed, brittle, but unmistakably addressed to her, "My dearest Emily," but never sent. The final piece of the puzzle had been found. Not a simple explanation for her mother's departure, but a complete, untold story, hidden for half a century, waiting for her to return to the house, to search, to finally understand. Emily sank to the ground, the diary and letters clutched to her chest. The silent chasm that had separated her from her family for so long was about to be bridged by the very voice she had thought lost forever. The ghosts of memory were finally ready to speak their truth. Chapter 4: The Diary's Whisper. Emily returned to the silent house, the leather-bound diary, and the stack of unsent letters clutched to her chest. Her hands trembled as she sat at the kitchen table, the very spot where she had found the first cryptic note. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was pregnant with anticipation, filled with the whisper of her mother's voice, waiting to be heard after half a century. She opened the diary first. The first entries were filled with familiar details of their family life: mundane chores, children's milestones, small joys. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. Entries from late 1971, a few months before Sarah's death, became increasingly frantic. Punctuated by desperate pleas and whispered anxieties. November 1971. Sarah's cough persists. It's more than a cold. Her breathing, it frightens me. Daniel dismisses it, says she's just delicate. But I see the shadow in her eyes. I feel it. December 1971. Dr. Evans confirmed my worst fears. It's rare, a progressive lung disease, incurable. He said there's nothing. My baby, my sweet Sarah. How can this be? Daniel is furious. He says we must tell no one. Not Emily, not our friends. He says it will ruin our lives. He wants to pretend it isn't happening, to live in denial. But how can I? My heart is breaking. My child is dying. Emily gasped, a choked sob escaping her lips. Sarah, dying. Not a sudden accident. It was a secret illness. Her mother had known. And her father had forced silence. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow, reshaping every memory, every assumption. She read on, her eyes blurring with tears. Margaret's diary entries became a harrowing chronicle of her desperate attempts to find a cure, traveling to specialists in distant cities, researching obscure treatments, all in secret, while maintaining a facade of normalcy at home. The financial strain was immense, the emotional toll devastating. July 1972. Sarah is fading. Each breath is a struggle. Daniel still won't speak of it, except to rage at me for not being strong enough. He makes me promise again not to tell Emily, to keep up the lie of health. He says it will crush her if she knows the truth of Sarah's suffering. But this silence, this pretense, it is crushing me. My soul is dying alongside my child's body. August 1972. It happened today. The well. They say it was an accident. They don't know. I don't know if she even knew. Perhaps it was a mercy. God forgive me for thinking such a thing. But Daniel, he's a broken man. He blames me, says I didn't watch her close enough, didn't save her. He won't speak her name or mine, except in accusation. He wants to believe it was a sudden, tragic fall, easier than accepting the slow, agonizing decay. He forbids me to speak the truth, ever, to anyone. My heart is a tomb. I cannot bear this silence, this lie. the accident at the well. It wasn't just a simple fall. Sarah, weakened by illness, might have been too frail to save herself, or perhaps, in her fading moments, found a strange, desperate peace. The weight of her parents' decision to conceal Sarah's illness, to construct a narrative of sudden accident, crashed down on Emily. Her father, in his grief, had chosen denial, a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable, to escape a slow, agonizing farewell. And Margaret, her mother hadn't abandoned them out of weakness. She had fled from an unbearable burden of truth, a suffocating silence imposed by her husband, a lie that was devouring her soul. The note, "This is not what you think," resonated with devastating clarity. Her mother's departure was not a betrayal, but an act of self-preservation, a desperate escape from a prison of enforced silence and a husband consumed by his own unacknowledged grief. Emily then turned to the stack of unsent letters addressed to her. Each one was a testament to her mother's desperate attempts to communicate, to explain, to reach out across the chasm of silence. My dearest Emily, undated, early 1973. I have left. I know you must hate me. Believe me, my heart aches with every step away from you. But I cannot stay. Your father's silence, his anger, his insistence on this terrible lie, it is suffocating me. I cannot breathe in this house, in this life, knowing the truth about Sarah and being forbidden to speak it. He believes he is protecting you, but this silence will only poison us all. I pray one day you will understand. I love you, my brave girl. Never doubt that. The letters continued, each one a raw outpouring of a mother's love, her anguish, her fierce desire to break free from the suffocating lie that was destroying her. They were filled with apologies, explanations, desperate hopes that Emily would one day find them and understand. Emily wept, deep guttural sobs that echoed in the empty house, tears not just for Sarah, but for Margaret, for the unbearable burden she had carried, for the years of misunderstanding, for the silence that had festered and wounded them all. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had been exiled by truth, a prisoner of her husband's grief. The diary, her mother's whisper from beyond the grave, had finally unburdened her soul, laying bare the truth that would forever change Emily's understanding of her family and herself. The path to healing, long obscured, had finally been revealed. Chapter 5, The Unseen Chains. The full truth, unveiled through her mother's diary and unsent letters, hit Emily like a tidal wave. Sarah's illness, her father's enforced silence, her mother's desperate flight, it redefined everything. The narrative of her childhood, previously a straightforward tale of tragic loss and abandonment, was now a complex tapestry woven with threads of hidden pain, desperate choices, and profound misunderstanding. Emily felt a crushing wave of sorrow, not just for Sarah, but for Margaret, who had borne the silent agony of her child's slow demise and her husband's unyielding denial. Her mother hadn't been weak. She had been incredibly strong, fighting desperately to save Sarah, then fighting to preserve her own sanity in the face of an unspeakable lie. Her departure wasn't abandonment. It was a desperate act of survival, a breakout from the unseen chains of Daniel's grief and his demand for silence. And her father, Daniel, the man she had always seen as stern, unyielding, who had stoically picked up the pieces after Margaret left. Now, Emily saw him through a different lens. He wasn't cruel. He was profoundly broken. His rigid control, his insistence on the accident narrative, his forbidding Margaret to speak the truth. These weren't acts of malice, but of a man utterly overwhelmed by a grief he couldn't face. He wanted to believe in the suddenness of the tragedy, because the alternative, Sarah's slow, agonizing decay, was too unbearable to accept. His silence was his fortress, his only defense against a reality that threatened to annihilate him. He had protected Emily from the truth of Sarah's suffering, a misguided act of love, but in doing so, he had created a chasm of silence that swallowed them all. The weight of this revelation was immense. Emily had spent decades feeling abandoned by her mother, living with the unspoken assumption that her mother simply couldn't handle the grief. Now she understood the profound burden Margaret had carried, the impossible choice she had faced: stay and be consumed by the lie and Daniel's unrelenting control, or leave and be perceived as a heartless abandoner. The unsent letters to Emily were particularly heart-wrenching. They were a testament to Margaret's unwavering love for her daughter, her desperate yearning to explain, to apologize, to connect across the vast distance that had opened between them. "I love you, my brave girl. Never doubt that." Those words, never heard in life, now echoed in the quiet house, finally reaching their intended recipient decades later. A mother's dying whisper of love and longing. Emily walked through the rooms of the farmhouse, each step heavy with the new knowledge. The living room, where Daniel had retreated into his newspapers and his silence. The backyard, where Sarah had played, where her short life had ended in a tragic confluence of illness and accident. The memories, once painful and fragmented, now flowed with a terrifying, agonizing clarity. She felt a profound sense of sadness for all of them. For Sarah, whose short life was marked by an unseen suffering. For Margaret, who was forced to carry such a devastating secret alone. For Daniel, who was so consumed by his grief and denial that he inadvertently destroyed his remaining family. And for herself, for the lonely decades spent living with a false narrative, unknowingly carrying the unspoken burdens of her parents' pain. But beneath the sorrow, a new emotion began to surface: liberation. The truth, however painful, was also incredibly freeing. The puzzle was complete. The silence was broken. The burden of not knowing had been lifted. She could finally understand her family, not as villains or victims, but as complex human beings, deeply flawed, deeply loving, caught in the devastating grip of circumstance and unspoken grief. The house, once a silent tomb of sorrow, felt different now. It was no longer a place of haunting, but a place of profound understanding, a sanctuary where the truth could finally breathe. Emily knew now that she had to stay. She had to restore it, to infuse it with the light of honesty and healing. It would be a monument, not to tragedy, but to the resilience of the human spirit, to the enduring power of truth, and to the complex, imperfect, but ultimately unbreakable bonds of family. The unseen chains of silence had finally been broken, paving the way for a new kind of peace. Chapter 6: Seeds of Forgiveness. The raw emotional intensity of the revelations slowly gave way to a deeper, more reflective sorrow. Emily grieved anew, not just for Sarah, but for the family that could have been, for the years lost to silence and misunderstanding. But within this grief, a seed of forgiveness began to sprout. She looked at her mother's diary and letters with reverence. Margaret wasn't a perfect woman, but she was a loving mother who had been pushed to her breaking point by a secret too heavy to bear. Emily understood now that her mother hadn't abandoned her out of a lack of love, but out of a desperate need to preserve her own soul, to escape the suffocating denial of her father. She had sacrificed her presence to save her sanity, hoping that one day the truth would find its way to Emily. And her father, Daniel. He had been a man of his time, stoic, believing that strength meant burying pain, his insistence on the accident narrative. His forbidding Margaret to speak the truth was a misguided attempt to protect his family from an even more agonizing reality. He believed he was shielding Emily from the knowledge of Sarah's suffering, and perhaps shielding himself from the crushing weight of a slow, inevitable loss. Emily saw him not as a cold, unfeeling parent, but as a man broken by grief, resorting to control in a world that felt utterly uncontrollable. In understanding his profound, misguided attempts at protection, Emily could finally begin to forgive him too. He was a victim of his own unacknowledged pain. The house became a space for this profound internal work. Emily walked through the rooms, no longer seeing just the painful memories, but imagining the lives lived within those walls. She pictured Margaret, a vibrant artist, stifled by a crushing secret. She saw Daniel, a man trying to hold his world together, tragically choosing silence over truth. And she saw young Emily, a bewildered teenager, grappling with abandonment and unexplainable pain. She decided to dedicate herself to restoring the house, transforming it from a neglected shell into a vibrant home. This wasn't just about renovation. It was an act of healing, a physical manifestation of her internal process of piecing together and rebuilding. She stripped away old wallpaper, revealing the layers of paper that mirrored the layers of her family's history. She sanded floors, uncovering the original wood, much like she was uncovering the core truths beneath decades of dust and silence. As she worked, memories, now unburdened by false narratives, resurfaced. Laughter in the kitchen, Sarah's high-pitched voice, her mother's hum as she painted, her father's quiet presence. These memories, once tainted by sorrow and confusion, now held a new poignancy, infused with the understanding of the underlying truths. Emily knew she would never truly get over the past. The pain of Sarah's death, the years of estrangement, would always be a part of her. But she could integrate it, she could understand it, and she could forgive. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past. It was about releasing herself from its bitter grip, about finding peace within the messy, complicated reality of human relationships. The first step was to acknowledge the full truth, to honor her mother's courage, and to grieve for the silent pain her father had endured. The next step was to live in that truth, to make the house a sanctuary of honest memory, a place where the full story of their family could finally reside. The small note under the tablecloth, dated 1973, had not just revealed a secret, it had unlocked a lifetime of suppressed emotion, setting Emily free. The house, once a prison of the past, was slowly becoming a testament to the enduring power of truth, the healing balm of understanding, and the quiet, profound strength of forgiveness, planting seeds of hope in the fertile ground of a reconciled heart. Chapter 7. Rebuilding the Foundation. With each swing of the hammer, each brushstroke of paint, Emily poured her newfound understanding into the old farmhouse. Rebuilding the physical structure became a deeply symbolic act of rebuilding her family's fragmented history and ultimately herself. She wasn't just renovating, she was curating memory, consciously choosing to fill the space with truth and acceptance, rather than the ghosts of unspoken pain. She found herself talking aloud to her mother and father as she worked. "Oh, Mom," she'd murmur as she uncovered a hidden alcove Margaret had described in her diary. "You truly were a marvel." Or to her father, as she carefully repaired a section of his old workbench. "Dad, I understand now. You were doing the best you could with the pain you had." The conversations, though one-sided, were profoundly healing, a way to bridge the chasm of decades. The house slowly shed its shroud of neglect. The grime of decades gave way to fresh paint. The creaking floors were repaired, and sunlight, once filtered through dusty panes, now streamed brightly into every room. Emily found joy in rediscovering the home's original character, honoring its past while breathing new life into it. She reimagined the kitchen, not as a place of silent betrayal, but as the vibrant heart it once was and could be again. The dining table, where she found the first note, was meticulously sanded and restored, its polished surface reflecting the light, a symbol of transparent truth. She placed a vase of fresh flowers on it, a small act of defiant beauty against the decades of dust. Emily also sought out a local historian, Dr. Alice West, a kind and insightful woman who specialized in oral histories and local family lore. Emily shared parts of her story, the unexpected discovery of the notes, the partial truths she had uncovered, while not revealing the most intimate details of Sarah's illness. She spoke of a family broken by unspoken grief and her desire to understand. Dr. West listened with deep empathy, providing Emily with a broader context of the social attitudes towards grief and mental health in the 1970s, which often encouraged silence and stoicism. This further helped Emily understand her father's actions, seeing them not as unique cruelty, but as a tragic reflection of societal norms. The attic, once a forbidding space of forgotten relics, became a sanctuary. Emily spent hours there, sorting through old boxes. She found more of her mother's artwork, vibrant watercolors, charcoal sketches, many depicting landscapes that mirrored the Vermont she had lived in after leaving. It was a tangible connection to her mother's continued life, a life of quiet artistry and resilience. She also found some of her father's old carpentry tools, polished and cared for, a testament to his own quiet dedication and craftsmanship. These were not just objects, they were fragments of their souls, finally understood. As the house became more livable, Emily felt an increasing sense of peace and belonging. She was no longer just Emily Johnson, the widowed woman adrift. She was Emily Johnson, the inheritor of a complex, beautiful, and ultimately triumphant family history. She was the one who had finally broken the silence, the one who had seen her parents not as they were perceived, but as they truly were, flawed, loving, and deeply human. She began to spend her evenings on the porch, watching the fireflies dance over the fields, the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. The sounds of the countryside, once melancholy, now hummed with a quiet life. The memories of Sarah, once a source of unbearable pain, now carried a bittersweet tenderness. Emily thought of her vibrant sister, knowing now the truth of her quiet suffering and the depth of her mother's desperate love. The foundation of the house was strong again, but more importantly, the emotional foundation of Emily's life had been rebuilt. The walls no longer echoed with unspoken sorrow, but with the quiet hum of understanding, acceptance, and the profound, transformative power of truth. The house was not just a home. It was a living testament to a family's journey from silence to solace, from pain to peace, a beacon of forgiveness shining brightly in the heart of Ohio. Chapter 8: The Unveiling of Light. The fully restored farmhouse stood as a testament to more than just Emily's dedication. It was a symbol of her transformation. Every freshly painted wall, every polished floorboard, every thriving plant in the garden seemed to radiate the light of truth and acceptance. The heavy burden she had unknowingly carried for decades had finally been lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace and a renewed connection to her family's true story. Emily knew she couldn't keep this truth entirely to herself. Her children, Lisa and Tom, deserved to know the full, complex narrative of their grandparents, to understand the forces that had shaped their own family's history. She invited them to the newly restored house for a family gathering, a silent ceremony of unveiling. Under the bright, unblemished light of the restored kitchen, at the very table where the first note had been found, Emily sat with her children. She laid out her mother's diary, the stack of unsent letters, and Sarah's locket. With a calm, clear voice, she recounted everything. She spoke of Sarah's hidden illness, her mother's desperate fight, her father's protective but ultimately destructive silence, and her mother's agonizing decision to leave to preserve her own sanity. She read excerpts from the diary, the raw pain of Margaret's words filling the room. Lisa and Tom listened, their faces a mixture of shock, sorrow, and finally, a profound empathy. Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she clutched Sarah's locket, realizing the true tragedy of her aunt's short life and her grandmother's impossible burden. Tom, usually more reserved, sat silently, absorbing the magnitude of the secret his grandfather had carried. "Mom, Dad, they lived with this all their lives?" Lisa whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes," Emily confirmed, her voice gentle. "Your grandfather believed he was protecting us all by keeping it a secret. He couldn't bear the truth of Sarah's slow decline. And your grandmother couldn't bear to live with the lie. She left a trail, hoping that one day I would find it and understand. The revelation was difficult, but it brought a new depth to their understanding of their family. Their grandparents were no longer distant figures defined by a single tragedy. They were complex, flawed, deeply loving human beings, shaped by an impossible circumstance and the difficult choices they made. It was a release, a moment of collective understanding and healing for all of them. The silence that had plagued their family for generations was finally broken, replaced by open communication and shared grief, now tinged with compassion. Emily also understood her own journey. Her years of feeling abandoned, of living with an incomplete narrative, had finally found resolution. The dream of returning to the house, the pull she felt, hadn't just been about property. It had been a call to uncover the truth, to heal old wounds, and to finally understand her place in the larger tapestry of her family's story. The house was not just a home. It was a sanctuary of truth, a living monument to the power of revelation and the boundless capacity for forgiveness. She felt a profound connection to her mother, a bond forged not just by blood, but by shared understanding across decades. Margaret had reached out from the past, trusting Emily to understand, to carry her story forward, and Emily had fulfilled that trust, not just for herself, but for the generations to come. As the sun set over the restored farmhouse, casting long golden shadows across the fields. Emily looked at her children, their faces softened by tears and a new understanding. The house, once a symbol of what was lost, was now filled with the warmth of what was found: truth, forgiveness, and a renewed, profound sense of family. The unveiling of light had finally illuminated their shared path, leading them from the shadows of silence into the clear, bright future of acceptance and peace. Chapter 9: The Living Legacy. Years melted into a gentle continuum, and the old farmhouse, now lovingly restored and vibrant, became the undisputed heart of the Johnson-Wilson family. Emily, in her early 80s, watched her grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the very rooms where her own childhood unfolded, the laughter now echoing without the ghostly undertones of past sorrow. The story of the kitchen table note, of Sarah's hidden illness, of Margaret's desperate flight, and Daniel's silent grief became a cherished part of their family lore. It was told with compassion and reverence, a powerful reminder of the complexities of human suffering and the ultimate strength found in truth and forgiveness. It taught the younger generations empathy, encouraging them to look beyond the surface, to understand the unseen battles people fight. Emily's relationship with Lisa and Tom flourished, deepened by the shared knowledge and the open emotional landscape they now inhabited. They visited often, finding solace and connection in the house, a place that no longer symbolized pain, but resilience and healing. Lisa, particularly, felt a profound bond with her grandmother, inspired by Emily's courage to unearth such a difficult truth. Emily herself had found a profound sense of purpose. She continued to volunteer at the local historical society, but her focus shifted. She began compiling her family's story, a personal memoir that wove together her own memories with the revelations from her mother's diary and letters. It was a painstaking process, but deeply fulfilling. She wrote not just for herself, but for her descendants, a testament to the fact that even the most painful secrets, once brought to light, could become sources of wisdom and strength. The wooden chest in the basement, where she found the diary and letters, remained. It was no longer a symbol of hidden anguish, but a sacred archive. Sometimes Emily would sit beside it, touching the worn leather of the diary, feeling her mother's presence, not as a ghost of the past, but as a guiding spirit of truth and love. The unset letters, once a symbol of profound separation, now represented a bridge built across time, a mother's voice finally heard by her daughter. Her grief for Sarah, though still present, had transformed. It was no longer a raw, open wound, but a tender memory, integrated into the larger, more complete understanding of her sister's life and the sacrifices made around her. She found solace in knowing Sarah's suffering had not been in vain, that it had, in a strange, painful way, ultimately led to the family's healing. The house, with its vibrant gardens and welcoming rooms, became a living legacy. It was a place where stories were told, where emotions were shared openly, where the past was honored and the future was embraced with hope. Emily had transformed not just a neglected house, but a fractured family. She had shown them that even the deepest silences could be broken, that even the most devastating truths could be understood, and that love, resilient and enduring, could heal wounds spanning generations. Her life, once defined by loss and unanswered questions, was now filled with purpose, connection, and a profound, quiet joy. The note under the tablecloth, dated 1973, had been more than just a message. It was a catalyst, a whisper from the past that had set in motion a chain of events leading to liberation, understanding, and the creation of a living legacy of truth, forgiveness, and enduring family love. The farmhouse stood, a beacon of light, its walls echoing with the wisdom of a story finally told, a family finally whole.